Wow. So, now is your chance to interrogate. And we've got a question immediately over there. Wait till the microphone comes and then we'll hear what you've got to say.
Thank you for your oration. Question. In Australian politics at the moment, we have a new Prime Minister who has formerly had involvement in the Republican movement for Australia. Given your obvious bias towards unity, what are your thoughts on whether or not Australia should seek to become a republic?
Right. I'm very aware of the fact this is an entirely closed meeting and that no one's going to repeat anything that's said outside this room. But as I'm going to be in Australia for a wee bit longer, I'm going to be careful, and I'm not going to tell you what to do. And frankly, it is entirely a matter for Australia as to whether or not it wants to become a republic or whether the Queen remains head of state. All I can say to you, from our perspective in the UK, it's interesting that in the Scottish referendum, the Nationalists were at pains to say the Queen will remain the head of state, because in the UK, the Queen is, rather more popular than any politician there is around. And I've always thought, if you were starting from here, you probably wouldn't have a sort of hereditary monarch. Those of you who watch Monty Python and the Holy Grail will understand the point that I make. You don't just suddenly pick someone up, but this is what we have. And of all the problems in our constitution at home, the monarchy is not it. There's plenty other things that need sorting. And, in Australia, you have to decide in the list of top 10 things that need to be sorted in this country, whether or not that one happens to be, in that top 10. But I won't presume to tell you what to do, though you might hazard from my answer where I might stand on that one.
In the middle first. That's it along. And then at the side.
Thank you very much for that alarming description. He's not here today, but what would be the 3 key pieces of advice, given your experiences, that you would give our new Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull?
You seem to very, not surprisingly, you're keen on Australian politics. Look, I think he's a new Prime Minister, and I was just saying this morning at breakfast, and I was looking at the papers, what you have to do is to establish your your impression with the electorate very quickly, and he appears to be making several announcements to be on that case. I think, secondly, you can only govern a country and win an election by staying in the centre ground. It's not enough just to appeal to your own lot, which, I see that's his pitch as well. The other one is, advice I'd give to any politician, is the same advice that Harold Macmillan, who was the Prime Minister in the UK in the 1950s, gave, and that's beware of events, because it's events that very often define you. And the thing about events is you don't know what they're going to be, but you just need, rather like 2008, the things I was telling you about, there was no textbook to read about this because it could never happen, could it? But when it happens, you've just got to deal with it. So I think that's the most important advice that I would give him, though I'd probably hasten to add before he says it, he probably doesn't need my advice.
Hello, thank you very much for that. It was a very good presentation. I have a question for you about accountability. In the back of my head, I'm uneducated, so I'll clarify that. At what point did you ever consider letting things play out to see what happens next, as opposed to coming back and actually bailing people out? Because aren't we taking the accountability away from the organisations themselves? So you're always sitting behind them and saying, hey, we're here to bail you out, you can do whatever you want, you can take risks, you can, look forward. But yeah, how do we make sure that those people are actually accountable for the decisions they make?
Well, you raise a very good point, actually, which was a live issue. I was talking to you about Northern Rock in the UK in 2007. There were those that said, this is a bank that's got itself into trouble because of foolishness, making wrong calls, and if you step in and bail them out, you remove what is known as moral hazard. In other words, they can do what they like, and there's absolutely no pain to be felt. And indeed, it was a view advanced by a number of people in the UK in the autumn of 2007. That would mean you would, if you follow that to the conclusion, you say, all right, you people have screwed up, you're on your own on this one. the problem with that is it would occur to people who had their money in other banks other than Northern Rock, that if Northern Rock was in trouble, others might be too. And actually the biggest one that was in trouble was the Halifax Bank of Scotland, which is one of the banks that collapsed a year later, which, you know, whereas Northern Rock is very small in UK terms, HBOS would be, you know, probably about the fourth or fifth biggest bank, and it's, you know, medium-sized in world rankings and so on. And of course, if that happened, and then it would move to the next one and the next one and the next one, before you know where you are, you've got panic. You know, and similarly, if you look at RBS, where it is fair to say that a succession of very bad judgment calls brought it, and frankly the country, to its knees, people have said to me, well, why didn't you just teach them a lesson and let it go? Well, the problem is, you know, as I said to you earlier, just think about it for 30 seconds. If the largest bank in the world collapses and people can't get their money out, what's going to happen to the rest of the banking system? And the point you make is a very real one, and actually the whole thrust of what we're trying to do, and I say we, you know, the international community is trying to do, by making banks hold more capital, by ring-fencing their investment arms and their retail banking arms, you know, in some places they're calling for them to be broken up so they're completely separate. What you're trying to do is to get to a situation where next time it happens you won't have to intervene. Now, I have to tell you that I don't think that's going to work either. Because, you know, the idea that you can have good banks and bad banks, or important ones and not important ones, you only have to look at two examples. Lehman Brothers didn't have a single penny of depositors' money in it. You know, it's an investment bank. And when it collapsed, the Americans, this is the Americans actually testing your theory, you know, because they said, right, you're going to go bust. It didn't bring the it didn't cause the collapse, but it actually brought about a situation where the collapse was actually inevitable. If they had the time over again, they wouldn't do it. Northern Rock is a deposit-taking bank. It's not an investment bank, but although it was small, it was still systemically very important. And actually, I didn't go into all the detail. During the crisis, we had to nationalise two small banks about Northern Rock's size. We had to intervene in one or two others purely to stop people panicking. We even had to intervene with an Icelandic subsidiary, mainly because most people in Britain did actually know it was Icelandic and had lots of money in it. And if it had closed, they'd have lost their money, and the risk was you get this contagion spreading. So what I'd say to you is, in times of good times, when a bank screws up, yes, you let it fail. You know, it's tough luck, but that's what you do. If you're in a full-blown crisis, actually the option that government has are much more limited. You can say, well, it's all your fault, tough luck. But what do you do if all the banks have gone that evening? And you've got a population that says, this is great, I can't get any food, I can't go home. You know, you don't want to be in that position.
Hi, I'm partly European, so the state of the European Union is of interest to me, and I'm seeing in every country anti-European Union sentiment, and I'm wondering how you might deal with that in England, because I remember living in the UK when the Channel Tunnel was being built, and I remember the sentiment in Folkestone was that we shouldn't build the Channel Tunnel because the smell of garlic was going to come through and permeate the British countryside. So that anti-European feeling has been there for decades, if not centuries. So how do you propose to...
Well, look, I think, be careful to use the word England, by the way. I'm Scottish. And it's, this, what I said to you earlier on during my talk was, you are right to identify there is this anti-feeling about, directed against our own government, directed against institutions. Most people actually in the UK are fairly well disposed towards Europe, in that an awful lot of us go on holiday there, a lot, not just once a year. The tunnel, smell or no smell, has been very, very well used right since the time it was built. Look at, you know, Ryanair and EasyJet have made an absolute fortune flying people, you know, to and from Europe. But I think I think when the referendum comes, a lot of people will vote, you know, and look hard-headed analysis of what it might actually mean in terms of trade and so on. But I think that the risk that I see is that people vote against it, not because they've particularly got anything against someone in France or in Italy or anything like that, but it's just they just don't, they're just against the establishment as they see it, because they blame it, one way or another for the fact that, things have been a bit rough for the last few years. The task for people who will argue to stay in has got to be, yes, you make an economic case, but as the Scottish referendum shows, you've got to do more than that. You've got to make the case for why it's good for Britain, how we feel about ourselves, our influence in the world, what we can do if we're going to win this referendum. Which you're right, there is a strand there, though most of it is not to say anti-European, but there's no doubt, that the issue of immigration will be run very, very hard by those people who want to come out.
I want to ask something completely different. I'm not good in economics and numbers and maths, but I'm from Europe and I'm really worried about the situation, about what's happening there. And because you mentioned a few times before that what was really important 7 years ago and what you learned and what you think that we also should learn from what happened 7 years ago was that you worked together, that governments work together. That's why everything got better. So do you think that now when the situation with refugees in Europe is what it's like, if the governments work together, do you think there's a chance that it will be solved?
Well, there's two issues here, and what I was talking about, particularly the Europe's response to the refugees, where frankly it is not working. Large numbers of countries who come to the European Union are now shut their borders or are channeling refugees through to Germany, who up until recently said they would take everyone. However, even if we were able to deal with all that, I think what you're getting at is a bigger problem, and that is the root causes of why people are coming in the first place. And the only way this is going to be resolved is of governments, plural, not just ones in Europe, but the United States, Russia, and the governments of countries in the Middle East and in the Gulf are prepared to work together to try and resolve the situation, and frankly they are not doing so at the moment. Indeed, Russia's stance in the world is well known. What they're doing in Syria now is they're doing unilaterally, they're not dealing with other countries. And equally, if you look at what is happening in Syria itself and look at who's backing ISIS, who's backing the present Syrian government, you can see there's far from any unity about sorting this out. The casualties, of course, are the poor people who are being bombed and being killed and for one reason or another are having to move. Similarly, if you look, it's not just in Syria, if you look at that, the entire area, and it's not just recent, the complete lack of international agreement to at least attempt to do something, never mind actually try and achieve it, is proving to be exacting a very, very heavy toll. So my answer to you, on the one hand, is a very glib one, saying, yes, we've got to work together, but it doesn't take me to tell you. Just look at what is happening, or more importantly, what's not happening at the moment. And I don't think any of us can be optimistic, I'm afraid, on that.
Continuing the same line of conversation, and at the risk of quoting back to you, you said of crisis management you need to act swiftly and you need to do more than is expected. And so with this refugee crisis, what steps would you recommend are taken?
Well, I stand by precisely what I said, and I suppose the counterpoint to that is if you don't do it, then you get what you've got, the refugee crisis. It is simply not practical, and you will never get the European Union to agree to take the volume of people now coming in. On some days, 20,000 people will come across the borders, and even in Germany, where they said they would take everyone, they're not saying that now. They're now setting up transit camps on their borders and so on. The only way we're going to resolve this is to get to the root cause. And I'm not optimistic about moving a border to Turkey, even if that is being done. And as you know, the political situation in Turkey is far from stable and settled. It is not going to get resolved unless something is done about the underlying problem, and that frankly will involve the United States because it is big, but it also involves the leadership of many of the states in the Middle East and the Gulf, and I don't have an easy answer for you. Sorry?
Just a follow-up to that. Just wait for the microphone, because no people want to hear what the follow-up is.
I do too.
And to put the second question, what would you recommend for Australia and its receipt of refugees and how we deal with that crisis?
Well, look, I think all countries have an obligation when people are fleeing because of fear of their lives, they have an obligation to deal with that application and to admit people if they are genuinely in fear of their lives. What is difficult, and it's not just an Australian problem, we have it as well, is how do you distinguish between somebody who's come here because they are afraid of their lives as opposed to, for understandable reasons, they want a better life. You know, if you've been in one of these refugee camps in Syria for the last 5 years, and your children with poor health are getting lousy education, they have no prospects, you can't blame someone for saying, well, I don't want to stay in a tent. You know, I want something different. It's very difficult for someone to distinguish between that and somebody who is being targeted because they happen to be the wrong faith or the wrong, the wrong type of politics. So I'm afraid, in all of these things, the banking crisis is difficult, but at least there are rational solutions to some of these things. If large-scale movements of people across the planet is a much more difficult thing to deal with, and even if you were to have a peace process, a peaceful solution, the idea that the problem would all go away and everybody would live happily ever after is doubtful. So I don't have an easy answer for you on that at all.
Alison?
Yes, there you are.
On the way back to the UK, you get a call from Angela Merkel, and she says to you that you've got full backing, you've got full decision making, and you're going to be parachuted into the Greek government to sort out their financial issues. How do you get started on what to do?
Well, I would refer her to Mr. Cameron living at number 10 Downing Street. Look, as far as Greece is concerned, the big problem at the moment, the overriding problem is Greece's debts at the end of the programme they're going through will be higher than they are now. There is nobody that actually believes they're ever going to be able to repay that debt. Nobody believes it. Not in the European Union, not in Germany or anywhere else. The politics of it, I do understand. The successive Greek governments have failed to collect the tax that is due. Money has been spent in inappropriate ways. You can see how the problems have built up. Yes, it's true that northern governments or northern banks lent the Greeks lots of money to buy stuff that they were exporting. But that's the world in which we live. I don't think you will get a Greek settlement that is durable unless, frankly, you write off a significant amount of their debt. Now, the reluctance to do that on the part of some countries in Europe is that that debt is held to a large extent by banks in Germany and France and so on. And anybody knows that a debt that is still notionally repayable, you don't have to account for. Once it's clear it's written off, then you have to book it, and we know what happens then. You then got to start making provisions and so on. And also, I understand that German politics, seemingly putting money to Southern Europe and so on, it's not terribly popular for the ordinary man on the street living in Frankfurt or Berlin or anywhere else. But unless you write off a substantial part of the debt, it's never going to get sorted. Yes, of course, you've got to insist that on Greece's part, it implements changes to pensions, to the collection of taxes and all the other things which will take time and won't be difficult. But as long as you've got something where everybody admits it won't work, it is simply a matter of time before something goes wrong again. And guess what? We have another Greek crisis, which will then destabilise Europe and start causing all the worries that come and go. And I said earlier, one of the big issues in the Scottish referendum was what would happen to our currency. And we kept making the point, currency unions only work with political union, which is why it doesn't work in Europe. And which is why I think the euro, it's an article of political faith rather than economic faith, but if it's going to last, then Germany and other countries have got to accept that to make this thing work, then resources have to go from the richer countries to the poorer countries to make the transition that they need. But short of debt write-off, it is not going to work. Which is why I'm not going to be parachuted in to do the job.
Does anybody want to ask a last question? Yeah, we've got one over there, that'll be the last one.
Thank you very much for your oration. You've been in politics now nearly 30 years. What advice would you offer, say, to a young person who wanted to go into politics, how should they prepare and what should they be aware of in terms of pitfalls?
Well, look, I suppose the first advice I would give anyone who's thinking of, becoming an MP or, doing politics more full-time is do something else first. Because for two reasons. One is you will bring more to the deliberations. The second thing is, if you've got a way out, if you've got somewhere else to go when it goes wrong or you're fed up or whatever, that makes you a better politician, I think, rather than if your entire life comes to a grinding halt if you lose your seat or you lose office or anything else. But what I think a far bigger message is that if you've got something to say, if you care about your country or you care about a particular issue, then you should get involved, have your say, and up to you to decide whether you do this at a very basic level by using social media or you go along to a meeting or whatever it is. But where the system will break down entirely is if a new generation don't believe that political argument resolves anything. Because if you don't resolve it by politics, then the alternative, as we've just been talking about, is horrendous. And that's why restoring and maintaining trust and respect is actually very, very important to politics. Unfortunately, it takes a lifetime to build it and about 5 minutes to lose it. So I would encourage people to do that, but for goodness sake, as in everything else in life, it does help if you're not thinking about these things obsessively and there's another part to your life, because it makes you a much more rounded person.